Hi, I'm Kat Stewart, partner in the HR practice at Eton Bridge Partners. I'm joined by Cecilie Sondergaard Nielson, executive coach and founder of the leadership consultancy CN8, to promote confidence in the workplace for women. To discuss a few of the main issues female leaders encounter, Cecilie has a really impressive track record of working with senior leaders to identify the change and dynamics that stand in the way of delivery and progress. So, here we are with episode 3 of Women in Leadership, talking about authority. It's probably first good to kind of talk to you about what the definition of authority is.
Yeah, so thanks for having me again. It's something that I think about a lot with the female leaders that I work with my clients, because it comes up a lot. And I think it's both the greatest challenge perhaps we face, but also the greatest opportunity we have to really create lives that we are proud of, that we want to kind of step into full capacity. We'll get to that. So authority it's the ability or the right or the power to make decisions, to enforce directions, to give orders, the power to order and direct, if you will. And I mean, if you think about it, when we're kids, your parents have it, your teachers have it, everybody else has it, right? But then we step into adulthood and we're expected to have it, with a few exceptions. The police obviously holds it in general, but hopefully you don't have situations with the police. Like if you travel, it's border control, but most of the rest of the time, it's really on you.
You're in control.
You're in control, or you should be, maybe we should say.
And when we talk about authority then, how do women feel about their authority?
So I think I use the word power, and it's interesting because often when I talk to my female clients about power, they really don't like that term. They don't want to have it. They see it as something kind of almost dark, negative, scary. And I guess if I'm being really naughty and generalizing, you could say that a lot of us have seen power be abused by the people who have it and have had it for centuries. But in terms of authority, it comes out more sneakily. I'd say most of my female clients have no issue calling themselves silly, calling themselves incompetent, calling themselves mean, selfish, all of the kind of bad things. But when I ask them to talk about what they like about themselves, or to talk about what they really want in their lives or their work, or to tell me how they're really feeling about something, it gets murkier, it gets tricky. That seems to be slightly more complicated for us to really take ownership of. So the way that it happens is that we look to people outside of ourselves, right? I call it crowdsourcing our opinions, like outsourcing our authority. We're basically looking to anybody other than ourselves to validate our decisions. It's like anyone else knows better than we do.
So where does that come from? Where does it stem from? Why do females do this?
There's probably many reasons. The two that I think make the most sense, and if you look at the research and some of the people who really looked into this, first of all, women haven't had authority for a very long time. If you look at it in a historical context, we haven't had authority over our own lives, bodies, finances for very long. And so we've had to rely on other people to give us permission, to give us approval, to give us validation, to provide us with safety for an awful long time. And I think now, when we suddenly have it, it's like, wait, what? Is this safe? Is this really allowed? And then, of course, you can look around in the world and what's happening in some other parts of the world right now, like Afghanistan, right? Women's right to be educated is under attack. You look to the US, women's right to choose under attack. Iran, women's right to cover or not cover their hair and not be killed for it, under attack, right? So I'd argue that there's definitely a part of our consciousness that's very aware that this is recent and fragile, and that probably makes us want to just hedge our bets by looking for some other authority other than our own. Secondly, for those of us who are above 30, if you think about growing up and the authority figures that you were presented with, the people who ran government, the people who ran the big businesses, even things that are traditionally within women's domain, like cooking, within the home, women were in charge. But if you go to like a Michelin star restaurant, the person in charge would typically be an older white male, right? And so I think there is this embedded socialized thing where we're so used to expecting that the authority is an older white male. It's not the older white male's fault, yeah, I always have to say. But it is problematic. And then when we actually have the authority and we have the power, we end up feeling like imposters because it's such a new, recent and unusual thing for us.
You're in a different zone, aren't you? You're in a different world almost.
Yeah, and it's not just women, right? It's any kind of minority traditionally.
Yeah. So what you're kind of saying is that within our brains, women basically don't see themselves as equal to men because of the lack of authority that they've had in their lives or that they're perceived to have. Is that so? How does the brain work when it comes to their psychology and their thinking?
I'm so glad you asked. I love a bit of neuroscience. I hesitate saying that this is how it is because it's a dynamic that plays out, and I'm sure there are plenty of women and part of the time and where this isn't happening. But it's in the work that I do, in terms of what I see, it's a very real thing. So let's talk about the brain. The brain is really three brains. So you've got you've got your human brain, which is the part that developed sort of last. It's your rational thinking, your analytical ability. It's the part that's going to sit here and say, but it's 2023. We totally have equality. This doesn't make any sense. And partly you'd be right from a totally rational point of view here and now. And then you've got your mammalian brain, which is where all of your emotions sit. It's the part that is in control of survival. It's where the little amygdala that triggers fight or flight when it sees a threat sits. And then you've got your reptilian brain, which is the first and oldest, which is kind of running your body, your heart beating, your lungs, breathing, all of that. So the thing that we need to know is that the mammalian brain, the fight or flight, the survival emotional bit, is not that sophisticated, and it operates to a large extent based on pattern recognition. And so when we look around and we know for centuries that we relied on the protection of authority and majority and relied on being able to fit in and play along and just follow the rules, and you start sticking your neck out and like taking big action and being in charge, that part of the brain is going, wait, what? Is this safe? Like, should you be doing this? So traditionally, in order to create safety, we've sought the approval of the authority, right? But now who's the authority? Is it us? Is there someone else? And there's this confusion. And I know it sounds a little bit bonkers, but I sit across from women almost every day.
So how does this play out then, that women are actually taking authority, and people listening and women listening will be thinking, well, I am in a leadership, in a level of authority. So what does that actually mean?
Yeah. And it's a very fair question, because you look around, right? And we have made a ton of progress, and lots of women hold, huge positions and take big action and really go for it, right? And I guess what I would want us to be aware of is the cost to the woman of doing that, and some of the things that are happening in the woman's nervous system, in her brain, that when we don't talk about it and we don't acknowledge it, can make these women individually feel like there's something wrong with them for struggling with some of the things that they struggle with while taking big action and leading organizations and stepping into the limelight.
So what you're saying is that there's a feeling underneath, and the brain is telling them something different from an imposter syndrome point of view, that they're putting their position and their authority, but actually the confidence behind and maybe what they're feeling inside is completely different than maybe how a man would feel in exactly the same position.
I think so. Like, I get a disproportionate amount of incredible women coming to me saying, I just want to feel as good on the inside as I'm sure it all looks on the outside, right? And I've just never heard a man say that.
Yeah.
Now, I'm sure there are men who've said that. I've just never come across them. So,
is that because men wouldn't necessarily want to admit that, and maybe females a bit more open about talking about it, bearing in mind they're coming into more leadership roles where they're owning more authority, and they may be kind of seeking help because they have external coaches or they're kind of, being developed in a certain way?
I think it's just a more natural thing for men, especially white men, to be in leadership roles. It is what's expected, right? There's no cognitive dissonance. Your brain isn't going off saying this is unsafe, don't stick your neck out, because you were always expected to stick your neck out. You were expected to be assertive. You were expected to be in charge, right? So there's no challenge to the natural order of things, if you will. Whereas when women and other minorities step into these roles that haven't traditionally belonged to them, there are parts of the brain and the nervous system that get activated.
Do you think you could give me and the listeners a bit of an example with maybe somebody that you've worked with about how you've supported them when it comes to this internal feeling around authority?
Absolutely. I have a client, a female client, let's call her Miranda, who is amazing. She's a tough cookie. She's in C-suite role in financial services on an executive team. She's done very well for herself. And I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and she arrived to her session, and she came and she sat down, and she was, I want to say, in a panic. Like, she was really spiraling. Yeah, so we started talking, and I said, "What happened? What's happened today? What's going on?" And she said, "I don't know. I just feel terrible, I feel really awful." I said, "Okay, but so what's your day been like?" And she said, "Well, I had a board meeting this morning, and I'm sitting in this board meeting, and there are things in my business that I think we need to talk about, that need to be addressed. I've been thinking about this, and no one seems to be taking action on it. And it's not technically really within my function, but I'm a leader in this business, and so I thought it would be appropriate to bring it up." And it should be said that Miranda is the only woman on her team, so she's in this room with her male colleagues that she gets along with very well, and her male boss that she gets along with very well, and she brings up this thing, right? She's thought about it, she brings rational arguments, analysis, she's very well prepared, brilliant woman. And it takes over the whole board meeting, completely hijacks the agenda. Couple of hours, they go back and forth, and at the end, everyone agreed with her recommendations.
Fantastic.
Right? I know, that's what I thought. Wait. And agreed to implement her plan, and got wrapped up, and all is well. And now she's sitting in front of me in a panic, which to her doesn't make any sense, because obviously on paper, rationally, she'd had a superb day in the office, right? So then what happens is Miranda's obviously going, "There's got to be something wrong with me. There's got to be why am I feeling so stressed out when actually everything's going very well?" Sweaty palms, her pulse, her heart's racing. She keeps staring at her phone, waiting for someone to call her and say, "You've been completely out of line, and we don't need your services anymore." That's what was happening for her internally. She was waiting for someone to fire her for having spoken up against what was kind of there and established.
Even though that in that room at that time, over the 2 hours that she was expressing her authority and her reasoning, it was agreed. Why would she go away and take that as an outcome of being fired?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's back to the point around the different parts of the brain, right? So in the prefrontal cortex, the rational, analytical part of our brains, we go, Miranda did very well. Miranda should be proud of herself. Miranda should feel good. In the mammalian part of the brain, Miranda's fight or flight amygdala is going off, pattern recognition. I'm in a room full of men, majority, my boss, authority. I should not speak up against them. I don't have the right to speak up against them. Who do I think I am to have an opinion that's different about what's going on? Again, remember, it's not that smart, right? Pattern recognition. This is not safe, shut it down. Or at least prepare for a phone call that you've been fired, because this is surely what's going to happen, because you've created a situation with a profound lack of safety.
Is that because she hasn't done that before? It's the first time she's had that experience, and maybe there's then paranoia as an aftermath, or guilt that, she's, done something kind of outside of her comfort zone?
I think for sure when I can't actually speak to whether she's done it before or not. Okay. I'm assuming it's probably there's something new about the situation. Maybe she's not done it to that extent. You know, maybe it felt like a riskier topic. Maybe I wouldn't call it guilt or paranoia, but definitely something got triggered.
Yeah. She wasn't sure what the outcome was going to be.
Right.
Yeah.
Which is why when we start to stretch, we always want to go a little bit gently rather than over a cliff, because if we go too fast too soon, our nervous systems literally pull the brake in order to keep us safe, even though that doesn't make any sense. But that is what happens. And when we don't talk about that, we end up with women thinking there's something wrong with them. But there's nothing wrong with them. It's actually their natural biological, physiological systems that just switch on the way that they were designed to switch on.
Can we talk about this a little bit more?
Yeah.
Because obviously she had you to go and talk to and download to. If she didn't have you, what do you think the consequences and the outcome of a female who was in that Miranda position, didn't take any form of action to come and talk about it? What would happen next to somebody like her in that organisation, and how would she react and act differently next time, do you think?
What might happen, what could happen, is that it gets stored in the brain as a really negative experience because you've spent an evening or an afternoon, the aftermath, feeling a high level of anxiety, right? And that creates, you start to build certain connections in the brain that saves that, right? I did this thing. I felt awful. I'm not going to do that again, right? Because our brains like to automate stuff so that it saves energy. So if I know that something's going to make me feel bad, I'm just going to store it in the kind of don't do that again bucket and focus on something else. So what could happen if you let this spin out of control because you don't know what's happening and you assume that there's something wrong with you, is you just make a connection between, I shouldn't have spoken up, I must have done something wrong because now I feel terrible, right? And then you don't do it again and you make yourself smaller in order to stay safe, which works in the short term. But what happens, of course, is that you close yourself off from being able to pursue the bigger things that you might want to pursue, the bigger jobs, the bigger dreams, to take big action.
And to make those decisions and to have a voice.
So the thing that then happens, generally, kind of bigger picture, is that I think a lot of women either they give up, they quit because it's just too hard, right? Or they try very hard to fit in and be more like everybody else and be more normal, which feels awful, right? And you cut yourself off from your uniqueness, and your organization doesn't get to experience your gifts, and it feels not great. Or we try and fight so hard to function in a system that isn't necessarily made for us that we burn out, right? We end up hurting ourselves. And that's why I think it's so important to speak about these dynamics. It's not to go on this constant feminist rant, right? But it's because when we don't talk about gender bias, the only thing left to fix is the woman, right? It's the Mirandas who are like, it must be me, but it's not her. It's centuries of cultural, biological, historical stuff that ends up playing out in today's boardrooms.
Do you think you could share with us some of the support and recommendations you gave to Miranda?
Of course. So the first thing I always do is have this conversation. Slow it all down, right? So we do a little bit of ideally nervous system regulation. There are things you can do to switch your nervous system from fight and flight into rest and digest. Little tricks, somatic practices. Do you want to see one?
Oh, go on then.
Okay. It doesn't work for everybody, but it works for a lot of people, and I use it a lot. So you grab an object. I've been told not to touch this water glass, and now I did anyway. And you pass it along the midline of your body, like this. And what that does is it interrupts whatever your brain is doing, whatever habit it's gone, like anxiety, spiraling, because now it's switching from left to right side of the brain, and it can't do both. So actually, if you ever experience anxiety, this might really help. It helps a lot of my clients. It's helped me as well. Very simple. Other things are, you can give yourself a hug. Not a lot of people like that. It's quite nice, actually. You can stand up and shake, dance, go for a run, exercise. So there are things we can do to just tell our bodies that we are actually safe and that it's fine, and just switch off the brain, or that part of the brain. So once we've come out of that immediate panic, we then have a conversation about what's actually going on, right? So it's not you. There's nothing wrong with you. What's happening to you right now is totally normal. Here's why it's happening. Here's what's led to it. So that, again, you can switch out of, it must be me, I'm wrong, because that creates a lot of shame. We've talked about shame. Shame is not good. We start to talk about how do we build more of an internal sense of safety, right? Because it's all well and good understanding what's happening, but what we want ideally going forward is for it not to happen, so that we can show up and have opinions and make recommendations and challenge what's going on, right? And that, depending on what the woman's been through, where she's at, can be a shorter or a longer process, but it always involves reconnecting with how we feel, what we want, and reestablishing that sense of boundaries of internal authority. Because what often happens is, because we've gotten so used to outsourcing it to random people on the internet, to our partners, to our bosses, when I go, what do you really want? The client goes, I don't know, which is never true. It can't be true. I know it feels true.
Is that because they want you to tell them
Yes.
what it is?
Which is when we start conflating expertise with authority, right? You can go to a variety of people for expertise, medical expertise. I don't know. What's another good example? How do you stay fit? Expertise, nutritional expertise. But it doesn't mean they have authority, right? You still get to choose what you want to do. And my job is not telling you what to do. It's reminding you that you already know what to do and handing that authority back to you. But sometimes that's a longer process that starts with identifying some of those feelings that we sort of taught ourselves that we shouldn't own, that we're not allowed, and seeing what comes up when we do and what they're there to tell us, which more often than not is stuff like anger, that we've actually been holding ourselves back, or been in situations that we maybe don't want to be in, and that we actually think, not that we're not good enough, but maybe we're too good. And so kind of bringing that up and gently beginning to look at it and integrate it and see where it takes us. So then once we're in more of a relaxed state, then the next step is we have the conversation about what is actually happening. Because what we don't want is the client to sit there and think that there's something wrong with them, right? Because that creates shame, and shame makes us want to hide. And when we hide, we don't take action. We don't pursue our dreams. So there's a whole process of explaining all the things we just went through of what is happening in your brain, what is happening in your body, in your nervous system. Where does it come from? Why is it like this? It's not just happening to you. It happens to a lot of us. It's okay. You're normal. Nothing's gone wrong, right? And then the process of reestablishing authority begins, really, of reconnecting the client with their own sense of self-trust, of, I want to say, worthiness, right? Of really being able to discern what it is that they want and how they want to show up, and creating enough safety to do that, which might mean going back and revisiting some of the experiences that have made them feel unsafe in the first place earlier on in their careers. Often we do need to process quite a lot of stuff that has happened that actually wasn't okay, but that got pushed under the rug because, again, a lot of people get told to just get on with it and not make such a fuss, and it's just what it's like. But we might have felt really angry and not have had a chance to express that, right? And so when we ignore experiences like that, we are actively undermining our own authority. So sometimes we need to go back to the past, do some processing, and then we start talking about, what do you want? What would it look like if you did feel safe, confident, showing up? What would you do? How would you speak? You know, what kinds of actions would you take? And then we test it. We start testing it little by little, not by taking gigantic steps that might actually create a backlash, like the one we talked about earlier, right? That might have been just too much too soon. But by figuring out little containers where we can start asserting ourselves and having a positive experience and integrating that and building and growing that until, you know, a couple of months down the line, suddenly you're doing these really big things and feeling good about it, and it's a complete change. And what you've done is you've worked with your brain and with your nervous system, and you've built, in the same way that we talked about, you can build a neural connection or a pathway between taking action and feeling anxious. You can also build one between taking action and feeling good, feeling positive.
Okay.
But in order to get there, you know, we have to be quite specific, quite deliberate in terms of the thoughts that we practice, the actions that we practice, the habits that we create for ourselves.
So I suppose people who come to you as a coach, I'm seeing this as they're almost replacing either their own authority or the other external authority with you, and almost putting it back into your side of the court to give them the answers. Would that be right in saying?
I mean, you're right in suggesting that as a dynamic, it definitely happens. They try, like most of my clients, some more than others. Is that fair? Yeah. Will at some point say, you know, what you just like, what do you think I should do? Tell me what to do. And most of the time, with very few exceptions, I won't, right? Because what we're doing here is conflating expertise with authority, right? So I don't want to treat my own medical conditions, right? I'll go see a doctor, but it doesn't mean that the doctor has, okay, unless I'm in a life-threatening situation, authority over my life, right? I might take the advice of a lawyer or a personal trainer or a nutritionist, but they don't have authority over me. They're just here to give me advice, and I'm all for getting advice, collecting data, collecting information. But my job as a coach is to help you remember that you have the authority over your own life, to hand that back to you, you know, and that's my training, to ask the right kind of questions and prompt the right kind of responses and connections and what have you, in order for you to remember that actually once we're done working together, you walk out the door, you have reestablished that sense of self-trust, of knowing. So no, in short.
Because it's really frustrating that we are still talking about this gender bias, and it is still alive and well, and we are still having to have these conversations, aren't we?
It's infuriating. I mean, some people would argue that 50 years on, we haven't made a lot of progress. Obviously, we have made some progress, but a lot of the conversations we're having are the same. Harvard Business Review calls it second generation bias. It's still there. Nobody wants to acknowledge it. And I get it, right? So that a lot of women have fought quite hard to be seen as equals and to get into these positions of leadership, of authority. And the last thing you want to do is call attention to yourself by saying, you know, things are different for me. I have these issues, whatever it is. So, but when we don't, again, the only thing left to then blame or point at is the woman. There's got to be something wrong with her, right? Why is she not confident? Why is she not assertive? Well, because there's all this stuff going on that we're not talking about. And just look at the statistics. You know, women still do up to 6 times as much unpaid care and domestic work in this country as their male counterparts. So if you have the same job as a woman, you still have 3 to 6 hours of domestic work when you get home, and you wonder why you're tired, right? Women's performance appraisal, this is my favorite stat, so you've heard it before, contains 70% of women's performance appraisals contain feedback on personality. Be less aggressive or more assertive or less collaborative. And for men, it's 1%, because men already fit the leadership model that we're subconsciously, in most cases, referring to. And what do you think that does to a woman's confidence? You know, most offices are 5 degrees too cold. Only 2% of venture capital funding goes to female founders, despite them making up 25% of all founders. There are 9 female CEOs in the FTSE 100 and no women of colour. I could go on. Do you want me to go on?
No, please don't.
No.
So what are we going to do about it?
I think we keep having this conversation out loud with everyone all the time, even though it's terribly boring. Well, it's not boring, but you know, it's a bit frustrating. And one could argue that we have better things to do. But I think it is very important to keep acknowledging the things that still need fixing instead of shoving them under the rug. And then I think we use the data that we do have to change our processes, right? So we know that there are elements of the hiring process, of the way we promote, the way we recognize performance that contains bias, and you know that we can do better. So doing that work, and there's a lot of wonderful businesses out there solely focused on helping companies do that work. And then I think you know we do more for our female leaders, for our minorities, so that they don't have to come and ask for it or pay for a coach themselves on the side, right? We stop sending them on generic leadership programs telling them to be more assertive and, you know, just do this. And we actually acknowledge that the dynamics that are happening are different and that different types and different levels of support are required. And there's nothing shameful about that. It is not the fault of the individual leader, but it is a flaw in the system. Then I think we all do everything in our power to get as many women and other minorities into leadership roles as quickly as possible, because representation matters, right?
So what is your stance on quotas then?
Yes. Challenging topic. I used to, like a lot of women that I meet, be against them, because I think the reality is nobody wants to be selected or hired or promoted because of their gender, right? We all want to be chosen because we are the best person for the job. But unfortunately, as long as there's this much bias in the system, if the leadership model that we're referring to, again, subliminally or otherwise, is a white male, and you're not a white male, you're never going to be the best person for the job. So does that mean you should never take the job? I'd argue no, because again, I think we just need representation, and then things will start to change. And that actually comes back to this point around owning our own authority, because when I have this discussion with people, what I hear the most is, oh, but I don't want other people to think that I got the job because of my gender. To which I always say, well, if you know that you really want this job, and you know that you're the best person for the job, and you believe that you can do this job as well or better than anybody else, and it's offered to you, why wouldn't you take it? Who cares what anybody else thinks? You can't control what other people think. Is it fair? Is it perfect? No. But if you work on that internal self-belief so that you can go and do it, and surround yourself with people who are, you know, maybe a little more like you, that will support you and start changing things from the inside, I think that is more important than whether someone thinks is, you know, quite frankly, stupid enough to think that you only got the job because you're a woman. And I mean, there are more than enough qualified females out there, right? So sometimes the other side of the argument is, oh, but we don't have enough qualified candidates. And having been a head of HR for 15 years, that is just not true.
Yeah. And I see that on my side of the fence too.
Right, you know this better than I do,
Absolutely.
obviously, right? It's it makes me so angry. Oh, we just can't find anyone. Really? Try harder.
Look harder.
Yeah, and maybe consider the model that you're hiring, you know, based on whether you need to tweak that a little bit so that it's not so biased against women.
Yeah. Do you find that maybe across the leadership teams that in certain job roles and job functions, this may happen more often than not? Because maybe in certain functions like HR, which actually is majority female led, and the profession seems to be creeping up with more senior female leaders, versus maybe finance, like the CFO, where there's maybe a shortage of that talent, and therefore when a senior CFO who's female gets offered the job, there's probably more chance maybe that they feel like that versus the chief people officer.
Yeah, again, let's remember that this is a dynamic that mostly comes into play when you are the minority or feel like the minority. and you are aware of the difference between you and the rest of the group, so to speak. And for sure, I think anything that is more traditional, kind of male-dominated, finance, really technical jobs. I mean, all of this is changing, thank goodness, right? But trading, this plays out. And I had a conversation with someone who runs a trading desk the other day about this, and he said, look, I really want more women on the desk because it changes the dynamic and it's really helpful for all of us, but I struggle to find them. And then there were a couple of other people in the room, and we ended up having this really interesting debate about whether you should then change the spec, right? Because if what you're looking for is so obviously focused on something that brings in mostly male candidates, aren't you then implicitly discriminating against women? And I don't have the answer, and it's not going to be the same answer across the board, but I do think it was an interesting question to ask ourselves. And again, you can probably speak to this better than I can, right? But how often are we actually catering to an outdated paradigm or leadership model, or just looking for qualities that maybe we don't need? Maybe we could do with something completely different, that if we included that, we'd get a much more diverse pool of people. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah. Big organisations have probably a lot more infrastructure and probably expertise to analyse job descriptions, and have D&I teams and recruitment teams that I think are quite well equipped at doing this. I think where we find it is typically maybe the smaller SME world, the founder-led businesses. Ultimately, they are who they are. They've kind of led their businesses. They've been strong leaders, and ultimately, it's their perception and voice and their language and their promotion of the role that they're trying to showcase to the external market that probably shows more bias towards men, because again, typically CEOs and founder and entrepreneurs have historically been more male dominated than females.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of founders and CEOs, I met a female founder who's done extremely well for herself, but she was talking about her early fundraising days and how, and I've heard this from several of the female founders that I work with, and how when she met investors on her own, she'd get like just a host of very challenging, strange questions. And then she made her husband a co-founder, and she started bringing him to these meetings.
Interesting.
And the questions disappeared. And it's just, I don't think people are doing this on purpose. I really genuinely don't. I've never met anyone who would, do this on purpose, but it's back to the bias, right?
Yeah.
There's a reason that so little of the VC funding goes to female founders. There's got to be a reason, right? It's not because they're less qualified.
So to try and conclude, what would be kind of the two or three takeaway points from today that we should share with our listeners about women in an authority, women who want to get into authority, women who are maybe struggling with their internal emotions around being in a leadership role?
Yeah. So what would I say? I'd say you already have the authority, right? It's already there. You just might need to reconnect to it. You might need to relearn how to use it. You might need to work a little bit with your nervous system and your brain to just develop it. But it's there. You have it, right? You can absolutely do all of these things. There's nothing wrong with you. That's the first one. The second one is we really need to acknowledge gender bias and the dynamics that are happening, because it's not about blaming or putting anyone or anything at fault. It's about acknowledging that there is a glitch in the system and that we could all do better. And then I'd say lastly, we have to find a way to get more women and minorities into leadership roles as quickly as we can, because, again, my point is never that there's something wrong with the male way of leading, if there even is a male way of leading. But let's say there is a traditional, generalized way of kind of male leadership. It's not that that is wrong. It's just that there's a lot of other ways of doing things that right now, aren't really getting the space or the air that they deserve. I think at the end of the day, we can have this conversation until the cows come home, but we really have to get more diverse talent into leadership roles.
Yeah.
I don't know why I'm telling you that, because you obviously know this already, right? But once you're in the job, you can show the world what you're capable of. And we just got to find a way to support that process better, I think, And so to that point, I will support quotas all day long if it gets more people, more diverse talent into the top jobs, because I already know what we're capable of. And now I'd like for the rest of the world to know too.
Same here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.